Hi, everyone, and thanks for joining us today for the next episode of the Jason's Take On. I'm Jason Whitehead, and going to turn this over to my co-host, Jason Noble. Jason?
Good afternoon and good morning, everyone, and thank you, Jason. I'm Jason Noble, based over here in London. Not too sunny London now, but welcome, everyone. This is our eighth podcast that we've done, eighth webinar. We're really excited to have everyone here, but another global audience, which is always good to see. This time we're talking about accelerating adoption, both user adoption, engagement, stakeholder adoption, and organizational adoption. If you remember back in February, we talked through some ideas as to how you can improve your overall customer onboarding and get your customer onboarding right. And the bold challenge that we posed as part of that webinar was, what change could you take fundamentally to rethink how you get your customers to drive their own adoption and success within their organization? So in this webinar, we're going to take that a little step further and really look at as to what changes can you make now proactively to increase the time to value within your organization. As we've done in previous ones, we're going to target anywhere from about 35 to 45 minutes. Please do ask your questions in the Q&A window as we go through, and subject to time, Jason and I will do our very best to answer them. Don't forget, we do have a LinkedIn group, so we'd really actively encourage you guys to pose your questions in there and to start a conversation going there as well, and we will follow up. Don't forget for our subscribers to sign up to the newsletter. We are periodically sending out information and tools that we think can be useful for you. And we're also going to start sharing more subscriber-only content going forward, which we think you'll find really useful. So keep an eye out for that. Just a reminder that there are two great training services that we want to let you know about. Firstly, the Jason. So myself and Jason are launching our own specialized training around various specific customer success topics that align with our webinar series. So keep an eye out, and we'll launch some timings around that. And then there's the Customer Success Mastermind series that Jason's doing as part of Triton's in collaboration with Success Track Enterprise over here in Europe. And there is a subscription training program as part of that. And I know Jason's going to tell about a little offer there that's coming there as well. Both of us are available for coaching and consulting services on an individual level or larger projects. So feel free to drop us a line if there's anything we can do. Just a quick intro from myself. So as I said, I'm based over here in London. I've been in the customer success space for probably around 8 years now, working with a number of different technology organizations, helping them build, lead their success functions. And I'm currently the VP of Global Success with a technology startup organization based over in Dallas. Jason, quick intro from you before we start.
Great, thank you. Hi, everyone. Jason Whitehead here, based in Washington, D.C. Really excited to be here. Really excited about this topic. For those of you who don't know me, I've spent over 20 years in the customer success and software adoption space as well. Early in my career, studied information systems and worked hand-on as an IT consultant and managing internal CRM adoptions for a couple of companies. And then what I'm really excited about this topic is, as part of my role doing that in-house, was really making sure that we were driving adoption, improving the value to the company and the executives, and actually went back to school and got another degree in organization development and human resources, and learned a lot of new techniques that were just incredibly powerful that I didn't have just from my IT background. And so excited to be able to share some of those today. So thank you so much for joining us. And before we jump on, just a quick little thing to let you know about. As part of the CS Mastermind, if you go to csmastermind.com, as part of our subscription training, we are offering for the first 10 people that sign up in June, we'll be able to gift to 5 of their customers a free license for our software adoption training. So as we're talking about software adoption training or software adoption today, Triton's has an adoption training that is just for the buyers of software. So your customers, the CS professionals, that can help them. And if you sign up for CS Mastermind in June, you can share a training course for free with your customers. So if you're interested in learning more, you can reach out to me at info@tritons.com, and happy to share more about that. So, Jason, that's my background, but do you want to kick us off with our bold challenge question?
Yeah, I will do. And as you said, what we try and do for each of these podcasts is pose a question to the audience, to you guys, to what can you do differently? How can you be bold? The theme that we've had for the last 8 months is around customer success leaders and professionals needing to take that step and be bold and do different things and help their organizations and their customers on the change and the journey we're going on. So the be bold question for us this month, and it ties in with the one that we had back in February, is how can you get your customers to change how they drive the adoption of your services and software to cut down the time it takes for them to achieve success by 50% or more. So what can you do to help your customers really cut down that time to value, that time of adoption, and by 50%? So really have a think about that. We'll talk about some ideas that we've got and give you some takeaways at the end of that.
Great. Thank you so much for that. And I think then just to start it off, Jason, why don't you answer this question, which is, what does adoption mean? Because when we talk about the word adoption, people throw it around a lot of different ways, but I think it means different things. So when we're talking about adoption, what do you mean by that?
I think it's a great question. It does. It means so many different things to different people. I think I touched on it earlier on, that for me, there's really 3 key levels of adoption that you need to think about. And this isn't just about getting the particular users engaged in using the software. You've got to think about, number 1, user adoption. So people are using the software, the services differently, as intended and as designed to create value. So look at them as individuals and what does it mean for them, but start getting them to see beyond just them using it, and what does it mean for their wider business, their wider teams, their wider organization, and the impact of what you're asking them to do on those others. And I think that's so important. So it really helps separate the value to them as an individual from the bigger picture. It is so important still to look at the adoption you're asking the users to do. We're going through some big changes. These guys are being asked to do things differently than they've done before. So you've got to consider that, and you've really got to be kind of understand how they work and what their thinking is. The second level of adoption is around stakeholder adoption. These are the decision makers within an organization. Typically, these are the guys that will have signed the check. But what you find often is that these people then step away and they don't have a lot more to do with the process to make sure they're getting value from it. So there is a whole separate layer of adoption for your senior stakeholders. So the decision makers, leaders, they are still part of the adoption process, but not necessarily the same as the end users. And really think about what it means for them. You've also got to look at the immediate supervisors and managers of the end users and how you can get them to help their teams drive adoption. And even if those managers and supervisors are not actually the people using and keying into the system, they've still got such a critical role in getting their teams to understand the change they're doing. But quite often they don't realize that. And it's important that us as customer success professionals can help them understand that and understand that level of engagement they need to do there and what they need to do. And I think there's a real need, and I've seen this in many organizations that I've worked for, is to make sure that your stakeholders are involved in that initial handover and initial onboarding process and meetings, really to get that alignment. So very typically, and I've seen this, you get the deal's done, the signature's there, the senior stakeholders step away. It's then left to the users to come on board. They're not quite sure of the vision, the mission, why they're doing it. And things can quickly go very separate in direction there. By getting the senior stakeholders involved in that handover and that initial onboarding process, they can help reiterate what their vision was, what their message was, what it means to them, to their organization. And it really brings the different groups a lot closer together. So I think that's a really, really important thing, is to make sure those stakeholders are involved as part of that initial onboarding. The third level, and I think this is the one that a lot of organizations and people miss quite often, is what I call kind of customer or organizational adoption. So this is the much wider level. This is the company. This really is all encompassing. It's taking that ultimate step up. What does this mean for the business? Why is our customer as an organization using our services, and what does value mean to them? What are the outcomes they're looking for? So you take it, the way to think about adoption is at 3 different levels, and they get more and more granular. So you've got the organizational one, the stakeholders, and then right down to the user one. And I think the key thing is, as part of this process, is what you've really got to do by looking at the customer adoption is get people to think about the different levels and help them connect the different dots and how it's really aligning the different groups and different people internally. And get people to focus on complete collaboration. How does you make sure that the stakeholders are collaborating with the users, with the supervisors, with the different people in the business? The better you can get that collaboration of all the different groups in the business working together, the better it is, and the closer you'll be to getting the adoption you want. I think one key thing to reiterate really, is that adoption isn't when you go live, and that quite often is a misconception. There's a lot of challenges, particularly when you're dealing with technology teams and project teams. A lot of the focus is on that time to go live, that initial deployment. But adoption's a lot more than that. Adoption is when customers are getting the value that they want from the system, they're getting the outcomes that they want. And as part of that, you need to understand what they are. So as part of your initial onboarding engagement process, make sure you understand those. And I think a lot of organizations and people still use adoption and deployed interchangeably when they are absolutely not the same. Jason, I'm going to turn the next question back to you to help us kind of clarify this a bit further. What's the difference between time to go live and time to value? So along the same lines as adoption and deployment.
Yeah, here again, I think people often focus on the wrong thing. And, when we work with our customers who are the buyers of software, we start talking about what their business goals are and what they're trying to achieve and what they're trying to get done. So many times they're talking about, on time and on budget, that's success for us. And we actually draw out for them sort of a return on investment curve over the life of an IT system. And if anyone's interested, if you go to tritons.com, we have a free e-course on this around why software projects fail, where we walk you through just how I draw out this graph of what they're trying to achieve. And so many times it's that, the first point to go live, and this is when users start coming on, and there's just an expectation that instantly people will start using the system every day simply because it's been turned live, and that they will instantly change their work habits and change the way they do their jobs on a daily basis to embrace the new technology. And the reality is that it's just not so. And the other challenge that we've seen so many times is people just focus on the go live and that little bit of product training that surrounds the go live, and then there's just sort of this hope that people will start to adopt it and to incorporate it to their daily jobs. But they don't really take any actions to ensure that happens. And many times they don't know what actions they should take. Many times they don't have the infrastructure in place to do that. But when you start to actually show the executives, like, when you first go live, you've got a whole bunch of sunk costs. You spent time and money and effort getting the system out the door that if you don't get any value from it, that's just all wasted effort and wasted money. And then slowly over time, as people start to incorporate it into their daily routines, then eventually you break even on your investment, but you haven't even achieved the value that you were searching for. And so many times you find that break-even point happens later than people expect, if it happens at all, and it doesn't always. And then further out still is the whole time to you actually get the value that you wanted and that you're trying to achieve. And when we start to ask executives, so whose job is it to make sure you get this value? Whose job is it to make sure you get that as quickly as possible? And what steps do you take? Usually they don't have any ideas and they don't really know, and then we haven't thought about that. So one of the things I highly recommend people start to do is draw out for people visually and look at that free e-course that we have, the simplest graph that every time I draw them out, I get such ahas that it really has been great helpful for them. And then you can start to get people to focus on the right things. And as a customer success manager, you should really do that at the very start of your relationship with the customer, especially if you even meet them pre-sale to get them focusing on some of those issues. Because then they start to have the right conversation of it's not about how fast we get it live, it's what we do with it after that really matters. And I think it's just sort of one last little note around that is so many times, even still, we find a lot of IT projects that are largely led or influenced by the IT department in their group and a lot of technical folks. And it's important to remember that most technical folks and most IT departments, they are rewarded on time and on budget. And that's their focus and that's how they're judged as success. But the business that's actually supposed to use the software and is buying the software many times, their version of success is a very different metric. And you want to avoid the mistake of hoping for A while rewarding B. And by that, I mean, hoping for A is hoping to get all this great value and solve your business problems, while instead of focusing on B, which is just the on-time and the non-budget deployment. So just a few things to think about there. But I think that does kick off another question, as we think about these distinctions between time to go live and time to value and trying to shift people's thinking. Jason, how do you actually go about positioning adoption success efforts during the sales process? How do you get people to think about that right up front?
I think it's a great question, and something that we don't emphasize enough and spend enough time and effort doing. And I think that the challenge is what we don't want to do is scare customers off before we've got the sale, that the adoption piece needs a lot more than they expected and is going to take a lot longer. You've really neatly outlined kind of the differences and the time difference between that time to go live and time to value. And they are different, and there is a bigger need of investment needed to get that time to value and investment needed from the customer. So I think that the key thing is what you don't want to do is scare the customers off as part of the process. But you've got to really introduce these ideas and ways of thinking so that the customer can understand up front, really from day one when they start having the engagement with you, that it takes time and effort and resource for them to help get that value and drive what the adoption is. And the more investment they can put in, the quicker we can get there and how it can accelerate that time to value. And I think that's really important to do. And I think the key thing is that these challenges between time to value and time to go live, it's not just the services and software that we're doing. It exists for all technologies out there. And creating that aha moment that the technology can do on its own really doesn't do it for them. You've got to look at the bigger picture as how we get there. I think one of the key things is in those engagement processes during the sales process is really differentiate yourselves as being a partner who can help and identify the challenges the customer's going to have as part of the adoption, but what you can do with the customer to address the user adoption and value creation. And I think that's really, really key. And one of the big challenges we've got is there are not many technology organizations who do this correctly. So if you can get in there ahead of the game, you've really got a nice differentiator between you and your competitors. And I think some of the key things to show is that get your customers to recognize many what I call trajectory metrics to show that you're on track with the adoption so that they're getting that time to value. How do you measure those aha moments? There'll be more than one of them. They'll be different for different users, but document them and then demonstrate to your customer when they've hit those moments that you can show what they are and what they're getting from it and how they derive that value. And I think this goes back to the whole definition of what values and outcomes are to the customer. And you need to capture those as part of the sales process so that when they come through onboarding, your onboarding team and adoption team can recognize that, can reiterate that, and really then show the customer what those are and how you track those. And I think one of the key things as well is to discuss with your customers during the process that what you want to do is how do you decouple adoption from go live. And as you said, Jason, that a lot of that focus is around that go live. You have your project managers come in, but quite often it's different stakeholders with our organizations. You know, the teams are different. It's no longer my onboarding team, no longer my project team. You're now dealing with the customer success teams, and they've got a very, very different way of working. So you need to really try and decouple the adoption, the go live process. I think that's really important for longer projects as well. So if you look at where it takes months or even years, there are still projects out there that are massive enterprise level deployments. You've got to look at how you change user behavior, user processes, performance metrics, and management activities a long time before the system goes live. What you don't want to do is go live and then suddenly start going through all of this change management process. So have your CS team, your CS function really help the customer start thinking about these bigger challenges that are out there. So it isn't just about the go live, it's about the whole change methodology and the adoption process. And I think this then makes it easier for people to start changing how they work. It helps reduce people blaming the system when some challenges that will come up are to do with organizational change, process change, management changes, not just simply due to a change in technology. And I think by changing some things early and working to improve performance before the systems go live, the customer can really start to realize their benefits and value a lot earlier in the process. So really get in there as part of the sales process. We've talked before about having your CS team come in probably when the sale is about 80-90% completed, just to start like bringing advocacy to light, bringing case studies to light. But you can start positioning what the onboarding is going to look like and how your success team will be functioning and helping them with that. And this brings me on to the next question I'm going to throw back to you, Jason. How do you reduce the time to value, and how do you accelerate the kind of adoption to get there?
Yeah, I think this is one that most people are trying to figure out, and I think it's such a challenge for many organizations because they don't even know where to start. And I found it interesting the other day. I was listening to a role play that a client had done, and they showed a couple of examples of the CSM trying to talk through, what does value look like? How do we get there? And then they sort of downshifted into, okay, you're not ready to go for this big piece yet. Let's break this into 2 phases. So we'll get some initial success. And then once we got that initial success, then we'll go for this phase 2 and roll it to this next user group, which at the surface made a lot of sense, but what they didn't actually do was define what that success would look like and how to get there. So I think one of the first things to do to reduce time to value is really get crystal clear in identifying what success looks like and what does the value look like, and setting very specific, the SMART goals, specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, time-bound goals for what you're going to do and get there. And have your customers say, this is how we know that we're successful and it's time to do more. And by the way, this is also what they're doing here. So they're telling you their renewal criteria. And it's really helpful to know that right up front, so you keep them focused on it, and also highlight for them and say, okay, to achieve this level of success, which is absolutely achievable, here are the steps you need to do by the time you need to do it. And those are typically organizational change metrics and behavior change and performance change issues. Once the system's live, usually it's relatively stable, not a technology issue. So really getting to shift that focus and be very clear on the goal is absolutely critical. And then I think one of the next things that people do, and they often skip this step as a CSM, is ask your customer about their history of driving success and driving adoption with any system. It doesn't matter if it's SaaS or on-premise or even a homegrown system, because what you want to try and do is identify if they have the skills and experience and structures that they need internally, the practices, to really achieve the realistic level of success with technology. Many organizations, when we go and we talk to them, they don't have anyone with any sort of change management background or user adoption background. They don't know how to structure a program around that. Or if the programs they have done in the past, have not been effective, then they probably have the wrong people or the wrong skills doing that. And they need to look for something different. So, I think one of the first things you want to do is find out what success is, and then figure out, do they have the ability internally to do that? And, if, for example, you find that in the past, they've only really ever achieved around 50% adoption of their systems, or usually get about 50% value, and many times it'll be even less, you have to ask the question, well, why will this be different? And what will they do differently to get a different value from us? And I think, as you go through and you probe a little deeper and you start to ask them, and you find that either they don't have the change skills or user adoption skills or history in their organization, then you need to figure out, well, how do we get them? Because without this skill, without these methods and practices, you're not going to achieve the results that you want. So let's make sure that you're even able to achieve success. So many times what I think more and more software vendors need to recognize is that the core competency that most of their customers need but lack is the ability to drive adoption of technology and the ability to get their own people to use technology in a way that creates value and that they collaborate more effectively. And if they don't have that skill, they're just not going to be successful. And I think then you can go through and look at some of the other things you can do. And there's obviously a lot of other steps that, as you're building your onboarding program, including that training around these adoption skills is important. But then also looking at when you get to that end user level, how do you hyper target and personalize onboarding functions for end users, for the stakeholders that have to drive adoption, all that great stuff? How are you planting the correct seeds and providing, very specific walkthroughs and demos and expectations around them? And, one of the other things I think that's very important is, as you have these great SMART goals for success and values, cascade those down to the different levels of your organization. So, for stakeholders and, managers and executives, they need to have a very specific goal of usage and adoption and value creation for their team that they can drive towards. And it's got to be within their realm of success. And then for end users, it's amazing when we talk to end users hands-on. Many times they're not even asked to use the system. They're not really told what they should be doing it or by when. And they're like, look, tell me what you need me to do by Fridays at 5 and I'll do it. But no one has ever asked me. No one has ever told me. So I can't hit a target that I don't know exists, which I think is pretty legitimate. So there's a lot of things in there that I think get missed that could be very helpful for a lot of folks to really accelerate that adoption. But, Jason, I think then sort of a related question for you is, what can derail adoption, and what sort of things should you not do that are going to hurt you?
I think then there are, as we know, there are lots and lots of things that you can do that really can kind of really cause problems for your adoption process. I think to kind of reiterate on a couple of them that we've kind of touched on already. The first one I talk about is really not having a structured adoption program really causes problems. So you've really got to look at putting a lot of structure, a lot of process around it, so that you can repeat it consistently and deliver the same one time after time and help your customers go through it. But having a program that makes sure that your users, your customers are actually using the technology once it go live is so important. So by not having a structured adoption program, that's one of the big things that can really derail your adoption. Something else is not having a single senior person as the owner for internal adoption success. And I think that that's critical. We've talked about this already, but having that stakeholder internally that owns it and is responsible for it, but can also invest time and effort to make sure that their business and their team are working through. That's so important to do. So make sure with your customers, you're identifying who that person is. I know there's an example that you've got that you can talk through here quickly, Jason. Jason? Or not? There was an example there. Jason had a client that was, you there?
I'm there. Sorry, I had
that's all right.
Muted myself for a second.
Yeah, there was the example that you mentioned yesterday.
Yeah, so we had one client actually started their software adoption program 6 months before they even selected their vendor. They were doing a multi-year, nationwide rollout of a CRM system, and they realized that adoption was 80% of their need, and that they didn't have the skills, and they had failed programs in the past where they hadn't put in place the proper programs and proper structure. So they brought us in to say, what are some strategies and tactics? How do we build out the department that we need to do this and to do it at scale? And essentially what they ended up doing is building out their own internal success team that really had a lot of stuff to do. And I think the lesson for them was that they really need to focus on the outcomes first and then work backwards. And I think if more organizations built out that infrastructure to drive adoption, drive success within their own organization, would deliver great results. So back to you.
Yeah, I think that it is so critical, that, and identifying those outcomes really helps drive what adoption is and what successful adoption is. I think another key thing that can really help, or not help, that can really hinder adoption rather, is a lack of empathy, a lack of people understanding. And this, as we said, the users tend to be the biggest group of people that you're working through with the adoption, and you're asking them to change what they're doing. And for some customers, that potentially poses a risk. You're trying to automate a lot of their processes that they may have been doing a long time. So you've got to understand that person, understand the impact that this is having on them. And by not understanding them, not having that empathy, that can really derail the process. All it takes is for one or two key users to really just not be on board with what you're trying to do, not understand the direction. It can really derail the whole process there. I think what you've also got to do is really identify and address user issues really quickly, and how that impacts individuals and groups. I've talked already about kind of users, but think about how it impacts the stakeholders. Think about how they impact the broader business. So kind of what would derail it is not identifying these issues up front. So it's really important to do that. The other key thing is you've got to invest the time up front to build the relationships. And Jason, I think it was a few months back that we spoke about building those trusted relationships. And if you don't do that up front, that can really derail the whole process. And if you aren't brought in as part of the sales process in terms of the customer success team, and you just come in at the handover process, you are starting the relationship on the back foot. And really, it's all about building that trust and relationship early on. And don't just start focusing on what is the outcome. Understand that person. So again, if you don't focus on that, if you don't invest the time up front, it can be a real challenge there. And I think the other thing I'd say is that if you focus too much, particularly when you're dealing with the users, on the what's in it for me, rather than how do I make it successful? What makes you successful that no longer applies going forward? How do we change their mindset from being what's in it for me about right now? So you want them to think about, what does success look like going forward, and what do you need to achieve success in the new world? So there's some of the key things there that really to think about when you're going into the adoption process, to avoid these things, almost gotchas. And some are difficult to avoid. But when you see them coming up, it's start planning and how you can work around them and actually taught your customers to do that. I think I'll throw this next one back to you, Jason. It's along the same lines as the question before, but what are some of the best practices that you've seen that can ensure success for adoption, and the systems that we've ultimately sold our customers to make sure they're delivering value?
Sure. I think there's a lot of them out there, and there's no one magic bullet. But unfortunately, I think we would all love that. But I think lumping together and building on a lot of different best practices can really have a huge impact. And one of the first ones that I often find is when I'm talking with with leaders in an organization, the phrase always comes up, oh, they'll have no choice but to use the system. You know, you've got the system is key to the workflow. There's no way that they can actually achieve what they need to achieve without using the system. And I think that's a very dangerous assumption. So if you hear that one coming out, that's a real red flag, because you know, the reality is people have a lot of choice. And it doesn't matter what the system is. There's degrees of freedom in terms of timing of when they put stuff in the system, or how accurately they're putting in, or how complete data is put in the system. Or, you know, in some workflows, it may be, okay, I just emailed this to someone else and they put it in the system. So we've shifted things around and made a lot of mistakes here. So I think if you switch that question from people won't have a choice to people have 100% choice or 100% discretion about using the system, that really changes your mindset, opens up a lot of possibilities, and saying, you know, what if I'm wrong and people do have a lot of choice? What would we do differently then to drive adoption? What other practices would we put in place that we might not think we need? And really start to go with some of those. You know, I think another thing I've often seen is people wait far too long in the process to start to think about adoption, to understand what that looks like. You know, and I think right up front, you need to understand from the sales team, who are the stakeholders and what are their relationships and what are the users and what are some of the keys to getting them to actually do what they need to do. You know, we had one organization that you know, we were brought in, they'd left the adoption to even thinking about it until just a few months before go live of a multi-year project. And we were brought in a few months before and really doing sort of a training and needs analysis. And when we did that, we asked a few other probing questions about what sort of organizational barriers would prevent people from using the system. What else do we need to address to ensure adoption? And by asking a few questions, we found that one department alone had to rewrite 30,000 lines of custom code before people could start to use the system. And they couldn't even do that until it went live. And no one had mapped this out. And the net impact is it was going to delay even though the system went live in February, they were not going to be able to use it until September, October at the earliest, and that's if they didn't do their day job. So this was a huge shock to people who, you know, spent millions in several years of work. Were expecting things to go faster, and they just didn't start their adoption efforts soon enough, and it really threw off their entire project. I think the other piece too is really getting customers to understand how big a change this is, and that it is so very personal for users and end users, and just how emotional it can become for people when they have not the technology itself, but have their work disrupted and have their prestige disrupted. So, you know, when you think about it as an adult, when you go and you meet new people or you're at a party or whatever it may be, you know, one of the first questions people come up to you and say, you know, so what do you do? And a lot of people have a lot of their identity invested in their jobs and a lot of, you know, their sense of self-worth in that. So if you're actually dramatically changing what their job is by introducing new tools and processes and technology, that has a really big impact on people. And in some organizations, when you implement new systems, you may have been a very important person before because of the new workflow or something else. Your personal clout and reputation takes a big hit. Some people, we see this time and time again, they're afraid they're going to lose their jobs. And management says, well, that's ridiculous. Of course, we're not going to do that. But the perception is very real and very debilitating for a lot of folks. So you need to make sure that executives who are leading these efforts understand that for people, it's a huge deal, and they need to take it those ways. You know, another best practice we've seen is so many efforts, they stop their change efforts at go live. And they're like, oh, change is just the initial deployment from before we had the system, and now we're after, so we're done. But instead of looking at it as an ongoing change effort, ongoing adoption program over the life of the system, you know, the system and your vendors are going to come out with new releases every few months or more frequently. You know, your employees are going to change as new people get hired and people transfer and all this other great stuff. You know, the priorities of your business are going to change. You have a lot of ongoing change here, and you need a way to manage that and keep that up going so that, you know, 2 years down the road, everything isn't so out of date that it's useless and falling behind and a ton of new people have come in. So I think structuring an ongoing adoption program from the start is really important, and a lot of people don't do that. You know, and then I think another big one is really recognizing that adoption is not just at the discretion of the end users. And, you know, there's so many barriers that can prevent people from using the system even if they wanted to. So, you know, one of the things we find, like if you're doing a CRM system, there's so many people downstream, like customer success and service and finance and marketing, that they can't do their jobs if, you know, the salespeople haven't put the data in right up front, or they put it in late or inaccurately or incomplete. You know, and recognizing in your organization that as an end user, you know, if you don't have a way to identify that you're prevented from doing your job, or your ability to be productive is, you know, inhibited by the behavior of others upstream, you're just going to ignore it or do something else. So making sure that people understand that here's the mechanism by which you can identify and escalate this to get resolved. Here's the activities you should take if the ability to do your job is inhibited, how you move forward with that. And there could be other barriers too, like data quality or access rights, or big one we see all the time are there a lot of competing priorities for other projects. And we ask people, well, why aren't you using the system, and why aren't you doing X, Y, and Z? And they're like, well, my boss has these 5 other projects that he said are more important, or she said are more important, so I'm going to do what's important to my boss. So no one has set this as a priority. And I think one of the other pieces that is really important for people to recognize along those lines is that recognizing that the immediate supervisor and the immediate manager is the biggest driver of adoption, yet many times they don't know it. And these managers and supervisors have not been asked to drive adoption within their teams. They don't know it's part of their job or part of their role to ensure people are doing their job in a way that enables success for the entire organization. So if your change efforts and your adoption efforts are really just focused on communicating, what's in to end users, or if they're focused on just training people on the process and the point and click of the system, and they don't involve telling the managers and executives, here's how you need to drive adoption in your team, here's what that looks like, you're not going to go very far. So missing that is a big red flag. And so I think that, and then obviously, as we talked about as a customer success team, making sure your customer has that deep expertise and the right methods to drive adoption and get value from technology, and that's going to be a really big thing. So if they don't have that, building up their skills in that area is really key, because then what they can do is they can drive adoption in their own organization on their own, and they can put less of work on your back as a CSM. Sort of that, give a man a fish or teach a man to fish. And you want to switch from giving a fish and spoon feeding them, doing so much of the work for them, to enabling them to do it on their own. So those are just some of the things that we found really impactful. But Jason, I think sort of the next point in the question that keeps coming up is, how do you measure user and customer adoption? How do you know that you're on the track and that you're doing the right things?
I think historically, you still get a lot of organizations, what they measure is very simple product usage metrics. So they look at kind of logins and beginning to look more and more at customer journeys. And those are still important, but I think you need to broaden it. It's not just about who's clicked on this login, how often do they log in. You've really got to look at kind of customer journeys within the product and what I'd call engagement metrics. A number of organizations I've worked with, we've implemented what I call transaction metrics. So you as an organization know what we expect our customers to do within the platform, within the service. So map that out, define that as a transaction, and there may be different transactions for different types of users, different types of use cases they've got. But if you can define those and map those out, they're then what you want your customers to be using within the platform. And I think it gives you a really, really good metric to then start tracking and seeing how your customers are tracking to what you think they should be doing, but you can evolve and iterate that as you grow and as you change, as the product changes, as you know more about your customers, as their outcomes and expectations change. But you can also, some of the other key things are around sending surveys out. I think you can send surveys that are focused just on adoption and just on the onboarding process. So I want to know before adoption, before onboarding, what do my customers want? I can survey them. I can survey them during the process, depending on how long it is. I don't want to risk survey fatigue, but I can ask them at key points during the onboarding process if it's meeting their objectives. And I can survey them at the end. And I think the end survey is a key one, is to understand satisfaction from my customers around the specific adoption onboarding process. But don't forget, with your surveys, make sure you survey across your full range of users and stakeholders that are coming through the onboarding process. Don't just pick subsets of them. And I said already, what you want to avoid is this idea of survey fatigue. We all get lots and lots of surveys these days. The number we get on a daily basis for NPS is incredible and still rising, but just bear that in mind. You've got to have a survey that really determines what we need from a customer and what actions we want from them. Make it really simple in the experience there as well. I think one key thing as well is, once we've defined what that first action or value moment is measure the time that it takes for customers to achieve that, and see how that trends over time. And that kind of measurement of your first action is really important. You can define that first action either within the transaction or the customer journey that I've talked about, or you define it as a separate value moment, but also define it, have it tracked, and track the time to it. And you can, by knowing the time and how you're seeing the time change over time, you can really see the impact that work's being done on your adoption process to really accelerate that user onboarding, that user adoption. I think that's really, really critical to do. Another thing I'd really talk about is the percentage of users either using the products. If you've got a big user base and very few of them are using it, that's a critical adoption problem that you need to address. But have that as a simple metric, but also percentage of users that are achieving their first action is another good metric to use. And you can use those as kind of gauges throughout the process that allow you to jump in and take actions when needed. Someone's asked one of the questions already from Michael Schwab about how do you help with the likelihood of users going dark over a free trial period? And this is very similar. So how do I measure how my users are using the service at different points? And if I look at the percentage of users logging in, the percentage of users achieving their first action, if I'm seeing those numbers drop off, what can I do? And there are things you can do, particularly depending on kind of the scale of the users, the segments they're in. I think, Michael, you've talked about kind of a free trial cycle. So these may be more smaller tier, lower tier segments. You can look at kind of more automated comms. So when you know a customer's not logging on as frequently as they should, they're not using the platform as you'd expect, they're not getting that value moment, or in fact, that value moment is a much extended process there. You can really send out automated comms there, personalized comms that really address that and address their needs, but also talk them through things that you've seen other users who have been successful with. I'd really use automated comms and the idea of a tech touch approach there. I think one key thing as well is to measure user satisfaction on the service and the product. So as I said already, you can use CSAT surveys for the adoption process. A lot of businesses tend to focus on customer satisfaction all around support, but don't use it elsewhere. I think it has a lot of value when you measure satisfaction on the new service and new product. So when people have gone live, is it achieving what they want to achieve? What's their level of satisfaction with the usage, with the customer experience? So these are key things to do. I think there's a lot of value still in more qualitative reports and success stories directly from the end users. So this is looking at case studies, at advocacy, but get your customers and your users to share how they've used the system to help them delight their own customers, to close more deals, to drive more value. And I think that's so important there. I don't know if there's something that you'd add on to that one there, Jason.
Yeah, no, I think the value of getting stakeholders to share their own success stories is huge. We had one client that, as part of a promotion effort, they worked with their customer, the CS team worked with the customer to capture success stories, and the customers, submitted. We closed another deal worth, 5,000 or 10,000, because of the software, and we did it in, 30 minutes instead of, 3 weeks, kind of thing. So being able to have those real results, I think, go a long way. And I think that does lead us in that too. If we've had a couple of comments coming through, which has been great, and a couple of questions. One of the things that we did have the question that is there something to lower the likelihood of users going dark, non-communicative, non-responsive over the free trial cycle? And we have individual subscribers who go dark during the first 14 to 30 days. And, they're mostly composed of non-firm users. And so, I think one of the things that I have found there too is that driving adoption is very different if it's an individual just doing a single license that's either for themselves or as a sort of a hunting expedition. We want to try this software and see if it's right for us, as opposed to driving adoption of large teams and large users in an enterprise type situation. And, I think when it's a large group, you really need to have those coordinated structures and plans, because there's so many interdependencies between the ability of one person to use a system is impacted by the way everyone else has done it. And I've seen this with Office 365 or with CRM or everything else. If the way in which people are collaborating is not effectively defined, and people are not being aware or not paying attention to how they do their job, it's just as important as how well they do their job. Things start to go off the rails pretty quickly. But what I have seen, though, that has been interesting for things like more of the question about individuals doing that is, one, if you can give them bite-sized tasks to do, like every day or every 2 days, by now you should have done this, or please go and create these 3 little steps so that people can slowly build confidence in what they're doing and build step by step, that we're seeing the results. That can go a long way in setting very specific, short-term adoption goals. Another thing I've seen is there's a company out there, Lead Pages, does a very interesting webinar series and mini training series that includes both demos of how to perform certain acts or activities within their site, but then also they include sort of subject matter expertise on the other sides of it as well too. So here's best practice for how to write a landing page. Here's best practice for some of the content. Here's best practice for image placement, all those kind of things. And here's how you do that in our tool. And I think for a lot of folks that they're trying to develop both a skill and figure out the right tool for it, the more that you can show the subject matter expertise blended in with the use of the tool, I think that goes a long way as well too. Do you have other thoughts on that, Jason?
I think exactly like you say, kind of the more that you can blend it in and make it less obvious and it's got to be transparent. I think that really is what your customers want. They don't want it as a separate process that they have to engage in there. And I think that's the key thing. Mm-hmm. You've got to make this just work for the customer. What you don't want your customers to do is to have to engage in multiple different ways using different tools, different platforms. The more you can do within the one really, really adds value there.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have another question here. Do you have a strategy for reaching into multiple layers within an organization to establish relationships with unique user sets to uncover frontline issues which can be caught ahead of time? Do you want to take a crack at that one?
Yeah, I can. And I think it's something that we've spent time talking about when we talked about relationships within an organization. And it's a challenge. And you've raised a really key point there, Steve. And I think quite often as a CSM, when you're first brought in, you're dealing with users, and quite often depending on the level of the organization, the level of your role, you're missing those multiple layers of seniority within the business. So you might know the users, you might know their managers and leaders, but you might not know the ultimate CEO, the stakeholder that's signed off. So that's senior stakeholder. And I think what you've got to look at, there's a number of strategies that I've seen work really well. One is know who the different stakeholders are within the business. So make sure you've captured the information on them, captured on the individuals, what their involvement is, where they're involved in the decision-making process, in the escalation process, but understand as well who within your business is effectively a peer for them. I think that's really important. And mm-hmm. There's value in then setting up, say, comms that you would do with the users. Make sure that you can set up those next level comms, either with the peer-to-peer one or more general comms that are specific to that group of users. So it might be that senior directors in your customer get a different communication from us than users there. And I think with the communications you send out, it's important to be consistent and keep sending them out and drive the message, drive the vision as to what you're doing, and keep that relationship really going. You shouldn't just be dealing with problems and escalations that the customers have. So I think it requires a number of different kind of fronts of action. One is different personalized comms depending on who the stakeholders are. The need to have different people within your organization reach out. And I've seen great effect where we effectively as a CSM function craft a message for our CEO to send out, but our CEO can then engage directly with the CEOs in the other organization. And that can really, really help there. And I think if they give you visibility, as long as you're sharing these comms internally, you can help build those relationships up there. So I think that's two really key things that I'd say on that one.
Yeah, and I think just sort of on that one as well too. Some of the things that we found is also depending on the nature of the question that you're trying to ask and where you want to go, some of that should be up to the customer to find out on their own as part of their user adoption efforts. And when we've worked with teams building up their internal user adoption practices, part of their effort is to go out and do some assessments and analyze what are their adoption issues and what are the challenges of their different user groups all the way through. And so I think as a CSM, it's always great to have more relationships with a customer and build those out and to ask your primary point of contact that you want to be connected to some people who can be representative. But also remember, part of the goal here is to get the customers to do a lot of that on their own so that it's taking work off of you. Now, you obviously want to understand as much as you can about end user perspectives, but try not to get suckered into doing too much of the customer's work for them, because that'll just drown you as a CSM in things that you don't have time to do or to do well.
Excellent. Well, I think we're kind of coming up for time, but as we said, what we like to do is kind of close out with a reminder of what the Be Bold question is. And the three key takeaways. And again, a really big thank you to everyone for listening. We've really enjoyed doing this. If you've got any follow-up questions, it's great to have the interaction and questions we've had throughout the webinar and podcast. But please do, we'll kind of put the questions into the LinkedIn group. We'll put the Be Bold question there. But a reminder on the Be Bold question, how can you get your customers to change how they drive adoption of your software and services to cut down the time it takes for them to achieve success by 50% or more? It's a big ask, but I'd really like everyone to think, what are some things based on what Jason and I have talked about that you could do there? And then the three takeaways that we really think are the key themes here is, one, don't just think about user adoption. As we've mentioned, there are also more senior stakeholders and different stakeholders within your customers that you're dealing with. And you've also got that organizational, that company level change to consider. The second one is make sure you've defined what success looks like, what the outcomes are your customer wants, and what the value moments are. So how will your customer know that they have adopted the software? How will you know? Make sure you define those upfront or as part of that initial onboarding process. And the third and final one is help your customers to think about adoption upfront and what it means to them and what's needed from them and from you as their partner. And don't just think of it as that go live, that there is investment needed, there's more resource needed, but what does adoption mean to them? What it is they want to see. So that's our three takeaways. Thank you very much to everyone for listening to us. We hope you've enjoyed it. We will, over the next few days, be publishing this as a podcast on all the different channels. And a big thank you from me until the next one in July. Jason, a quick thank you from you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Really enjoyed it and appreciate all the comments and questions, and hope you will join us next time. And if you enjoyed this, please go ahead and share it on social media and LinkedIn as well, too. We're always looking to build our audience, and people are always looking for great resources. So we hope you enjoyed it.